All right, folks, we've had some wonderful ideas that have been shared by our four speakers tonight, and you have been sending questions to us, and certainly we have more questions than we're going to be able to get to all tonight, but we'll try and address some questions to each of the speakers and get through as many of these as we can. Again, and you can continue to text in messages and share them with hashtag #TransformIdeas if you would like as well. So, Dr. Morgan, I'm going to address this first question to you, and just to summarize, as we look at out of wedlock births or kind of family breakdown, there's a huge disparity in that, as we know, and we've talked about this before. How do we go about rebuilding that? And it's one thing we often work. Many of us as Christians talk a lot about protecting family values. But what does it look like when you're trying to rebuild family structures when families have broken down so much?
Okay, you want to start off with the easy one, huh?
You have a degree in marriage and family counseling, so, and I think it's a doctorate. So.
All right, brother.
Yeah.
There is a big disparity. I think the last time I was doing some research, some very high number, like 75% of African American women were having children out of wedlock. Now, when you look at the way society functions, when you look at service providers, for instance, there is no services for the nuclear family, hardly at all. So you're either a single male, or you're a female with children, or you're a single female. Now, think how that translates into reality. If you are a woman in need and you get more money for having more children, even without a dad, and you need more money, what are you going to do? And so if you need services where you have a male already in your life, but you are prevented from having access to those services because you have a male in your life who might be fathering those children, then you have to take different avenues to be able to get the things that you need to meet the needs of your children. So I think unconsciously there's an underlying undergirding of families being destroyed by the way we do services in the United States. And we actually end up encouraging people in some ill-informed behaviors that perpetuates that kind of behavior. And we need to come up with some kind of ideas, and we need to come up with services that really address the nuclear family and give them the abilities, the life skills, the coping skills, the relational skills that they need to have desirable outcomes in their lives.
So part of it is how we design services, and maybe the rest of you want to chime in on this as well if you have any thoughts. But I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how do we rebuild? How do we recreate family systems as a healthy norm if, as you just described, the high percentage are not two-parent families? Any of the rest of you have thoughts? Is this something you've considered before, or have ideas about how we could work to rebuild that as Christians?
We do a K-12 sex education program at Hope Academy from a biblical perspective. The biblical understanding of the family is taught right at kindergarten. So every year we're trying to reinforce a biblical model of sexuality.
And I think the church really can be a real adjuvant in that area. We have large churches, we have mid-sized churches that stay empty for the majority of the time. And I think we need to start stepping out and opening those churches up. We talk about homelessness a lot, but the church has the avenues to take in a lot of homeless people in those big spaces that they have that are really nice, to give children those 10,000 people that are homeless every night in the Twin Cities a safe place to stay with their children, and a place where they can be nurtured and encouraged and given the support system.
Great. Good, good. I want to ask another question, Latoya. This is to you. In your talk, you referenced the riots of the '60s, and a question that came in was talking about that. And is riot ever appropriate, or what other kind of means of sending a message are there? What other kind of advocacy and activism, especially when people's voices have not been heard through normal means? What are the kind of things that maybe we as Christians ought to engage in more actively so that voices are heard working against injustice?
Yeah. Well, to the question, are riots ever appropriate? I think that I would answer it with a question to say, well, why does a riot actually happen? And there are so many different reasons. So in this context of race and racial disparity and racial oppression, a riot, and I won't claim these words because I believe that maybe some leader far greater than me has said it, and maybe not in this way, but a riot is an outcry for people who have not been heard, an outcry for people who have tried different avenues but have been stopped short. When it begins to boil over, the people that are closest in proximity to you are going to experience the rage that has boiled over from not being heard, from not being served, from being neglected, from being oppressed. And so that's when we see riots happening. When it comes to the question of, well, what are some other ways of advocacy? One, I think that slowly becoming not the majority in our country anymore, but the white moderate needs to be a part of the conversation. We need to be here, but we also need to be having this conversation wherever your workplace is, because there might be doctors and there might be lawyers in here, and it is our responsibility as a church to do what we can wherever we are with whatever we have. And so you need to bring that conversation. If you have influence in policy and government policy, if you have influence and resource or network in that area, that's where you need to be bringing your advocacy. And maybe sometimes it needs to go to the streets in order to bring awareness, but it also needs to be brought through all these other different avenues wherever we are. I work in youth ministry, and so the way that I advocate is I'm walking and I am standing in the gap with these young people every single day. I'm advocating for them at school. I'm advocating for them in our communities. But what's your job, and where can you advocate? Those are the possibilities of that are really endless, and I think that we don't need to limit ourselves to marches or riots, but we need to transform the way that we are thinking about advocacy as well.
One thing that's been helpful to me when I've observed and seen protests and activism, even if maybe I don't feel called to go out and join that, but at least to say, okay, there's something here that I need to look into and learn about and understand the cause that's behind this, and maybe that's part of what we do. Dr. Morgan.
Well, this goes all the way back to James Cone, Gutierrez, Frantz Fanon, Reinhold Niebuhr, where Martin Luther King diverged from his theology because Reinhold Niebuhr felt that there were times when violence would be permissible. But Martin Luther King, in studying Mahatma Gandhi, said that violence need not be the avenue, that the standard is love. But it's gone from, Martin Luther King kind of to become a victim of revisionist history. Because what happened was, he said the marches of the 60s and so on would no longer, towards the end of his life, be sufficient to accomplish what they had up to that time in the civil rights movement. So they began to move forward in mass civil disobedience, where before he died, he was gathering like 3,000 poor people from across the country to go and sit in Washington indeterminately and to create a mass civil disobedience movement in America. And that may be one of the things the reason why he may have been killed.
Dr. Brown Young, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that in a university setting, because how do you, as a dean of students and maybe people you work with, think about how to kind of guide and coach young students? Any of us who've been to college know, when we were that age, the blood ran hot, and and we want to teach constructive that. So in your setting, I mean, are these things that you have to think about, and how do you guide them?
Almost on a weekly basis that we have some sort of protest or assembly. And, I think there are a lot of administrators that I work with that are actually afraid of when students or any other group gathers on our campus. They start to kind of lock down the building. And I'm like, we work at a public institution. You can't be locking down the building. But everybody has a right for their voice to be heard. And usually when they are gathering, it's because they felt like all the routes that they've used, nobody was listening to them. Nobody was paying attention to them. So they have been gaining momentum, and I see it stronger and stronger every day because our students use social media. I mean, and that just takes off like wildfire. And, our important thing, my goal is when I know that there is going to be a protest or an assembly that comes up, that we really try to reach out to the organizers, because first and foremost, we want to make sure that everybody is safe. We want to make sure that, nobody is getting hurt, that there's no destruction of property or whatnot. But I encourage students to use their voice. They have every right to use that voice. Just because you step foot on a college campus does not mean that you lose your constitutional right to do that. And so I kind of welcome it. But what I don't welcome is when some of the protesting and the activism speak untruths. And when they want to just incite the crowd and get them hyped up, but they're not telling the truth. So that is when I get a little disappointed, and then I have to make sure that I'm try to have a conversation with those individuals offline, but to really hear what their issues are. What are their, and I don't take demands, because that means there's been a breakdown in communication. That means we have not spoken. But if you have recommendations or suggestions about how we can do different things differently or improve, then let's talk. I want students to be involved in that shared governance process to make change.
That's a great example, and maybe what we can aspire to is that in the rest of society, we'll actually have those conversations and try and identify, okay, what are the things that need to change. Dr. Brown Young, another question specifically for you, and you were talking about how do you teach students self-awareness? So that was something you mentioned in your talk. Maybe you could just share briefly. So how do you do that? What's your strategy?
We have a number of leadership, not just formal classes, but we try to integrate and teach students about leadership, about who they are. We weave all this into the curriculum. And so we know that most of our students spend about 80% of their time outside of the classroom. So we encourage them to get involved in student groups, get involved in working a job, having some student employment. That really does help teach some of the leadership skills, the empowerment skills for our students. How are we teaching them to be self-aware, to know who they are? To break down some of those barriers. I mean, this is a time for students to be growing. This is their time to develop. And I tell them, if you are, still feeling pretty good, you haven't stepped outside your comfort zone, you're not getting your money's worth when you come to college. You need to get uncomfortable. You need to be in the uncomfortable zone for a little while, because we have a very complex world, and you're going to have to be faced with some situations that you have never ever dealt with. I mean, we have students who come from rural areas who have never been in an urban environment, and vice versa. We have students who have never left their town. We have students who come from schools that maybe had 50 students, and we have 55,000 students on our campus. And so it's a big change. And so, but again, we can't be closed-minded in saying that our way is the best way. And so we try to immediately, during the orientation and continuously through classes, getting them involved in their residence halls, to teach them about who they are, to challenge themselves on a daily basis.
So here's another question that came in, and I'm actually going to ask all of you to try and address that, and that is how does I as a white person best engage in and advocate for these causes and pursue this cause of racial harmony? And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And Russ, I'm going to ask you, in your experience as you have done that as an educator, what have you seen in your context that's been effective with students of color that you've worked with? But Dr. Morgan, I wonder if we could begin down here and just, the question was, how do I as a white male best advocate for my African American brother and sister and engage in this cause alongside of them? I'm wondering if each of you would just maybe give one or two maybe leading ideas that you have towards that.
Well, I think moving into the neighborhood like Brother did and really connecting with people and modeling what you espouse, I think it's tremendously important. Like when we went on the Sankofa trip, when the white brothers, they really listened, and the African-American brothers opened up in a way that I've never seen African-Americans open up in front of white men in my life, because white men were not trying to correct the brothers and said, no, you don't really feel that way. Let me tell you how you really feel.
Yeah.
And I think
for those who don't know, you and I went on a Sankofa trip. It's a civil rights pilgrimage. There was about 30 pastors from the Twin Cities that went on that journey. Some of them are here together tonight, and so that was a powerful experience.
And I think being authentic and not putting the person of color in a one-down position, but an equal conversation that has connection, that is authentic, that is genuine. Or genuine caring, compassion. I don't think it's that difficult of a task. I just think you need to be able to walk in it and get past your discomfort.
Good, thank you. Latoya?
Yeah, I think echo that. I think there's a dying to yourself that happens when you decide to walk in the path of reconciliation, and not only that, but advocacy. So if you are being an ally, there are some things that you are going to have to die to, and that's maybe this idea that you have all the answers, or this idea that maybe somehow you have arrived as an ally, or that you have made it there. I think that it's a constant dying and laying down, even this idea that I have if I'm a white male or a white anyone, I have this guilt that needs to come to the forefront, and I need to express that to you, my colored counterpart, right? I think that it's laying that down and saying, I haven't arrived, and I don't know it, and I'm continuing to learn it, and it's an everyday process. I won't arrive, right? It's a continued journey, and I think that's
good. Thank you. So Russ, the question was, how do I, as a white male, and you are a white male, but you've also done this, and you probably have some insight that you would share with others and say, these are things you should do.
Maybe put the emphasis on the word do. Part of it was thinking, how am I going to change the whole school system of the Twin Cities, right? I don't have to do that, right? But I need to take responsibility and do something. And for me, it meant starting with a little school, 3 teachers in a little church basement, and 35 kids. I didn't know that it would grow to a 500-person school then. I just knew that I would be disobedient if I didn't do something. Because I was that priest in the Good Samaritan story every day, walking past. Sometimes I'd say, Lord, you really ought to tell someone to do something about this problem. and sometimes I could hear the Lord say, well, there's this one guy in South Minneapolis that I'm working on, but he's got 2 big problems. He's got a hard head, but you know what's even worse? He's got a hard heart. Because the thing that most kept me from doing something was unbelief. I think the greatest hindrance to our moving ahead in racial harmony is unbelief in the gospel, unbelief in the promises of God. And I'd say maybe the first step, you all mentioned it a number of times, is it's really humility. It's turning the conversation from a you problem to a we and an us problem. And like you said, when you move in to the neighborhood, now it's a we and us problem, right? When you put your own kids in that school, right? Now it's a we and us kind of a thing. And so there's risk involved. But I've never seen any redemption happen without cost. So there's going to be some kind of cost involved.
Thank you for that word. Dr. Brown-Young?
I absolutely agree with everybody who has spoken before me. First of all, recognizing the power and the privilege that you have already been given as a white individual. But I would challenge not just white individuals, but all race and ethnicities to really get involved. That really is the key. When I talked about the action-oriented, that means being engaged in your community, being of service. That's what we are about as Christians, servant leadership. And so, if there are opportunities in your own neighborhood or not in your own neighborhood, get involved. I live in Maplewood, but I serve as a Girl Scout troop leader for 7th graders in North Minneapolis because I so deeply wanted to connect through the members of my church and in the community to help expose them to some of the critical skills that I know that they need, just even having somebody to talk to them and talk with them and to be a role model and to engage them and expose them to all kinds of different areas, not just within higher education, but within science and business and media. So it's about action.
Please.
So one more harsh anecdote, I think, would be to get out of the way. There have been so many instances in my own life, I think, where I was able to step up and lead and come out of a situation where and I'll say this, that I am a product of generational poverty, and so I can remember specific instances where a white man who was dear to me just simply got out of the way so that I could lead. And that doesn't seem like a fair thing all the time, but you need to be able to point out and recognize those instances where you can just move.
Dr. Morgan, you used a word in your talk called repairment. And I heard somebody else use that word in the form of reparations instead of reparations, reparations. And if I understood you right, I think you're talking about repairing, not repaying. And so I'm wondering, what are repairs that we ought to be working towards? What are things that we can be repairing?
Repairment is an important word for me, and it's not 40 acres in the mule. It's more like FDR with his New Deal and Fair Deal, when after World War II, they created certain kinds of movement economically for people who were challenged to get ahead. The problem with that is that it was dispensed in a segregated kind of way. And so when I say repairment, especially speaking economically, because Dr. King started saying towards the end of his life, it's nice to sit at a counter, but if you don't have money to buy a shake, what good is it, right? And so repairment is creating opportunities, us moving away from the conversation of disparity and start moving into the conversation of maximizing opportunity. Because when we maximize opportunity, we allow people to be put in a position to do something positively about their lives, to repair the damage that has been done to them through eons of racism, inequality, and so on and so forth, that they become people who take charge of their own lives, but also have the resources, the avenues, and the ability to sustain their success and desirable outcomes.
Good, thank you. Russ, a question for you, and you talked in your talk about 5 things that your school does that you think make a difference, and the question was, not every student in our city is going to be able to go to Hope Academy, but they're going to go to other schools. So how do you take those ideas and transfer them into other school settings? How might that happen? How do you envision that being possible?
Yeah. I think there are what people would call wraparound services. So where churches and other ministry groups can go to a school and provide some wraparound kinds of services, where they're maybe doing tutoring after school or providing food for weekends for families and things like that. What I always say is that programs don't change people, people change people. Programs don't change people, people change people. And that means that every one of us, right, has an opportunity to build a relationship with an inner city child that would be life transforming. Every one of us. We're not hindered from doing that. And so that would be a really powerful way of doing that. Certainly the high expectations, the parent involvement, and the accountability are things that are somewhat transferable. Of course, the one that right now is very difficult to transfer is the first one that I mentioned. And so people will often come to me and say, Russ, you guys at Hope Academy are doing such amazing things. Wouldn't it be great if you could set all that faith stuff to the side, and then you could collect all the charter school money that's out there? I say, well, the day that we do that, I'll be on a ladder with some red paint on the front of the building, because we're changing the name of the school to Hopeless Academy. and I, as many times as I say this, people still don't get how the gospel is the power of God to do this. So sometimes I'll get people to say, well, if only the schools would wear uniforms, and if only they would do this. I say, you're not listening. You're not listening. Those are not the main things. Those are secondary and tertiary things. The main thing is the transformation of the heart. And so that is a challenge, but still we can all engage with a child. We can all do what you're doing at the Girl Scouts there. Thank you for doing that.
And WRAP means Wellness Recovery Action Plan.
Say that again. We've got to catch it.
WRAP means Wellness Recovery Action Plan.
Great. The issue of multi-generational poverty has been brought up, and I've heard a term and a philosophy used recently called two-generation solutions. And I'm wondering if any of you have thought about that, or maybe LaToya in your work at Urban Ventures or other places, or Dr. Morgan at the Mission. What are some? I mean, this is maybe a new way that we need to look at, because you talked about not all people start off at the same place. And we focus on the youngest generation, or maybe the adults. And so we've got to look at these as systems. Tell us a little bit about two-generational solutions.
Yeah, I would. We don't start off in the same place. I think that one common thing or thought or idea that probably is at the forefront is that the solution starts with the children, right? So the youngest generation to be experiencing poverty. But I think when we talk about this idea of wraparound services, it has to include the older generations as well. And so the two-generation solutions, to me, you have to take a look at the two generations. And so you don't just start with kids who have inherited disadvantages and think that solves the cycle, that solves the issue, that stops the cycle. There are habits that are formed among generations that you have to get to the source of, because those habits, even if you are wrapping services around a younger generation of kids experiencing poverty, the habits are going to persist, and the mindset is going to persist, and you have to wrap those services around the older generation as well. That's the gist of it.
We're coming to the end of our time, and so Dr. Morgan, I'm going to let you go ahead and answer that question, and then that'll be the wrap up to our evening here.
Well, Union Gospel Mission, that's what we're about, breaking multi-generational transmission processes. There's a difference between situational poverty and generational poverty. 38% of people who are working are of the working poor. And so what you have to do in dealing with poverty, you have to give people the avenues. You have to give them education, like we've been talking about this evening, because education and gainful employment are the only two avenues out of poverty. So if we don't educate, if we don't give people with their GEDs, if we don't give them life skills and coping skills, if we don't resolve the multi-generational transmission process where problems are handed down from generation to generation unresolved, there is no recourse but for that family to continue in that vein. So we work to make families healthy, individual by individual, because if an individual in the family gets healthy, the whole family has to change.
Would you join me in thanking our guests here tonight and our speakers?